Hi, my name is Laura Wexler, and I'm a professor in American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and I'm a historian of photography. And I'm deeply involved in the process of the creation of digital humanities projects and curricula here at Yale. And one thing that Ken Penko didn't mention in the morning that I also want to tell you about is that the year after next, so that's 2014-2015, I will lead a year-long Mellon Foundation-sponsored interdisciplinary digital humanities course for graduate students, which is the first of its kind in the university. So I'm really, really interested in these questions of the creation of curricula and bottom-up innovation and flexibility and all these things, and also the support that we've been hearing about so far. Now, briefly, I just want to say a minute about how did I get here, someone like me, and then I'm going to introduce Peter. One of the things that Yale does very well is to teach our students how to tell a story about their academic lives. The faculty sometimes learns to do this as well, but we also tend to stick with the professional stories that we've made, and once they're polished, they don't get amended all that much. In my own case, the story that I learned to tell involves the fact that I began to imagine a career in the humanities in a university as an undergraduate student at MIT, where I studied both photography and the humanities. Upon graduating from Columbia with a PhD in English and comparative literature, I had two job offers. One was from the American Studies faculty at Amherst College, a great American Studies program, and one was to go back and join the humanities faculty at MIT. And I, to amend Robert Frost, chose the path more traveled. And I went to Amherst College and then eventually to Yale teaching American Studies. But in fact, all the time, that other path, the lessons I learned at MIT about problem-based scholarship, team-based research, the capacity of engineering to illuminate the visual world, these lessons and the passion for the technological underpinnings of thought have always informed my humanities scholarship. And in fact, if you go back, I was originally a 17th century scholar, and if you go back in European history as well, the science is not separate from the humanities. Recently, through my work in helping to develop the digital humanities at Yale, I've been able to bring these two long-standing passions together. And this convergence, I think, is on offer here for everyone. The paths not taken also actually do reappear, and right now are reappearing. Now is an exceptionally promising time for those of us in the humanities at Yale to re-examine the story arc that we have been telling about our own formations as humanists, and to see where some of those excitements of the past merge with the new opportunities that are opening up for all of us. I want to share one of my own recent insights with you. We in the humanities often think of working with computers as working in different languages, which for one reason or another we failed to learn in college. We think that there is an X programming language and a Y programming language and a Z programming language. And of course, this is true. But I have spent the last several years in small and large groups listening to engineers and programmers and others talk about digital humanities projects, and often they are talking about and in languages that I do not know and understand. However, recently something quite remarkable happened to me, and suddenly I began to understand what all this talk about these different languages had to do with topics that are especially and passionately interesting to me. I think of this as the Helen Keller moment. Do you remember when Annie Sullivan held her one hand under the water flowing from the pump and signed the word water into the palm of her other hand? And suddenly this blind and deaf child made the connection between the word and the thing. She is born into language, and from that point, her place in the world as a reasoning being is forever changed and spectacularly augmented. This, I think, is what is going on for us now. What we are studying with the digital humanities is not only languages, digital programs, computer language X, Y, and Z. It is a new stage of language itself. And the human world, the human place in the world, is forever changed by it. This is our Helen Keller moment. So now I'd like to introduce Peter Leonard. Peter Leonard holds a BA in art history from the University of Chicago and an MA and a PhD in Swedish literature from the University of Washington. He is currently, right now, responsible for humanities research computing at the University of Chicago. He is a co-principal investigator of a Google Digital Humanities grant that uses topic modeling as a technique for exposing hidden structure in the volumes of Google Books. And he was the organizer of the 2012 Chicago Colloquium on Digital Humanities and Computer Science. He has taught and published in the field of Scandinavian literature as well as digital humanities, and he is the recipient of many awards and recognition in both arenas. He has been a Haystack Scholar. He has held a Fulbright Scholarship at the Uppsala Center for Multi-Ethnic Research in Sweden, and most recently a Google Digital Humanities Research Award. His interest in contemporary Nordic literature, Peter says, is specifically about, quote, new post-ethnic configurations of national belonging in Scandinavian fiction. And, he writes, I am broadly interested in digital and quantitative methods in the humanities, including text mining, network analysis, image analysis, and corpus query engines. This means that he brings special interest in analysis and visualization using large bodies of electronic text, in networks and large-scale text analysis, and in issues and inspiration to be found in libraries. Those are the titles of some of his recent papers. But Peter is also the incoming librarian for digital humanities research at Yale University. Many of us, greatly to our benefit, will be working with and learning from him soon. When he came here for his job talk, not only was he inspiring and visionary as a digital humanities practitioner, he easily made a great big room full of diverse people very excited about Scandinavian literature. I am very delighted to ask you to please join me in welcoming Peter to this conference and to Yale.
Thank you, Laura, for a wonderful, very kind introduction. I promise there's only one slide in this entire PowerPoint with umlauts on it, so it's nothing to fear. It seems like I can still remember when Mark Turin asked me to give a talk here today. It seems like only yesterday. And when he did so, I thought about what are the ways that I could sort of try to contribute something to a conversation at which so many senior people from whom we've heard today have already given their insight. And the way I thought I might be able to at least start a conversation here would be to talk about digital scholarship, broadly conceived, and the archive, broadly conceived. And I want to use the word archive as opposed to library, although we are standing inside a library, certainly one of the great ones in North America, if not the world, because I think that although the library stands at the center of a lot of collective practice and stands at the center of a lot of scholarship, we want to think about not only the holdings of Beinecke and of Sterling and other libraries on campus, but also the holdings of individual faculty members and graduate students, the holdings of text mining operations that have been going on for a long time, the holdings of journals. So I want to think about the archive in a kind of generic sense. And I want to think about the impact of the digital on the archive. And in thinking about that, I thought that there might be two ways that we could understand the impact of the digital, broadly conceived, on the archive. And it seems to me that it's unquestionable that the digital has brought an enormous challenge to us, at least in the humanities and the history fields, which is it brings us the challenge of scale. We have organizations which are central to a lot of our research, such as Google Books, HathiTrust, JSTOR, the Internet Archive, that are giving us anywhere from a couple thousand to up to 20 million books in the case of Google Books right now. This is kind of an unprecedented challenge of scale for people in the humanities and in history and in allied fields who are used to working at the scale of intimate texts. But there's also something else that the digital brings to the archive, and it brings new approaches. And these new approaches can be thought of as a response to the challenge of scale. So in the language of computer science, in the language of people who are used to dealing with big data and thinking about algorithms to make sense of that data, we have the sort of overall umbrella of machine learning. We have phrases like latent semantic analysis, the implicit structure of unlabeled data. And all of these terms have been sort of reinterpreted and given humanistic labels by practitioners within the field in the last couple years. We have Franco Moretti's term of distant reading. We have Stephen Ramsey's term of algorithmic criticism. Martin Mueller from Northwestern uses the phrase scalable reading. And each of these ask us to complement, not replace, but complement our close reading, the thing in which most of us are trained, with a kind of macroscopic perspective. So a zoom out as opposed to a zoom in. And as we were talking about, this type of perspective, this type of complementary approach to reading at great distance and reading at a very short distance is really important for all of these archives that I've put up, ranging from the 20 million books in Google Books all the way down to a phrase that David used just today, the thematic research archive, something which could be relatively small, stored locally, perhaps maintained and built locally. And you've got all these things in between, special collections, people doing research digitization, JSTOR's Data for Research program. All of these archives, small and large, I think both suffer from problems of scale, but also have the opportunity to meet that challenge through new techniques. And in thinking about my subtitle, Microscopes and Macroscopes, I started thinking about a panel at the MLA this year in Boston, which was called Literature Laboratories. And the interesting thing, this has brought together people from University of Nebraska-Lincoln and Stanford and Harvard Meta Lab, all these people thinking about the literature laboratory as a concept. And this notion of the literature laboratory was once, I think somebody told the story of Gerhard Casper, the leader of Stanford, saying when he was first proposed that he should help fund a literature laboratory. Isn't that a contradiction in terms? Gerhard asked. And I think one of the ways that that question was answered at the MLA panel was that the word lab, the word laboratory, is actually doing some work. It's doing some labor in that phrase, in that compound phrase, the literature laboratory. That the laboratory implies a space of exploration, of collaboration, of empiricism, for good or for ill, for methodological innovation, experimentation, and sometimes for failure. And so in thinking about the humanistic laboratory, I thought, well, what kind of lab equipment would you want in such a space, whether it's physical or virtual, whether it exists in a library or in a computing center or just in our heads? And it strikes to me that, you know, the things that we are trained to do in the humanities and history is often to make small things large, to spend years analyzing them and reading them carefully. And that's, of course, what microscopes do, right? But macroscopes do the opposite. They make large things small. They allow you to zoom out. And the notion of a humanistic macroscope actually, at least as far as I can tell, comes from Kari Berner, who's a professor in informatics at Indiana University. And I think that this notion of a macroscope zooming out on big data is compatible with Martin Mueller's notion of scalable reading. You can see this is Martin Mueller's blog. You have a kind of telescope up there, right, which is really bringing the distant close, but you could imagine flipping that telescope around and making things which seem quite close to you to be far away. These microscopes and these macroscopes, we've known that these types of tools have been important for a long time. All the way back in 2006, Greg Crane writes this article, What Do You Do with 1 Million Books? We now have the problem, what do you do with 20 million books? And of course, the reality is many disciplines haven't done a great job of dealing with this problem of scale, even in the analog world. So Franco Moretti writes this terrifically titled article in 2000 called The Slaughterhouse of Literature. And he says, majority of books disappear forever, and majority actually misses the point. If we set today's canon of 19th century British novels at 200 titles, which would be very high, they would still only be about 0.5% of all published novels, which is visualized down at the bottom. This sort of great unread, to use the language of Moretti, this is present in every subfield, no matter how obscure, how unimportant. In my own field, this is what the 19th century print explosion looks like in Scandinavia, captured by Google Books, at least until the 1923 copyright cutoff. So this is about 160,000 books in my small field. I did the math, and if each volume is 40,000 words, then that's about billion. It's a lot of words you have to keep in your mind. Nobody can keep all that words in their head in the same time. Nobody can read that many words in a lifetime. So you have to redefine what it is to read. And the good news is we're going to get help with that from disciplines that perhaps we haven't worked very closely with in the past. Disciplines such as computer science, statistics, information retrieval. One way of thinking about making the macroscope concrete is to take a case study. And it's a case study of modernist poetry, which is a field that's being investigated by a couple faculty members at Chicago. And the interesting thing about this field is it's, of course, modernism. There are many modernisms, and they occur at different points in the globe and in different spaces and in different understandings. Modernist poetry shares in many countries this notion of the little magazine, the sort of poetry journal that collects the stuff and publishes it. So there's this interesting site of publication in the history of modernist poetry. And also, I alluded to the question of globalism and transnationalism. These poems are often translated and appear in different countries. And so we have this interesting concretization of the exchange of ideas across national boundaries. You can see some of the data I'm about to present at literarynetworks.uchicago.edu. But when we were thinking about this problem of modernist poetry writ large, we thought about a couple different ways of trying to solve this problem, of trying to get into this archive. We thought, well, maybe we'll just look for keywords within all of modernist poetry. We'll look for the word love, or we'll look for the word nation, or something like that. And you can imagine the problems with this, is that you have to know what the corpus is before you know what words to look for. We thought maybe we'll use cataloging metadata. Maybe we'll look up all the poems that are filed under the subject love, or all the poems that are tagged nihilism, right? Well, the problem is there really aren't really good subject indices to these types of poems at a granular level. And the last idea we came up with is maybe we should let the poems organize themselves, give them some agency in the matter. And you know, most people, when they hear this idea, they think that's not going to work, that's crazy talk. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this notion of self-organizing data. There are a lot of different ways of doing this, right? We have explicit and we also have implicit signals. We have metadata that's explicit about the poems, and we have also latent signals within the text itself. Let's start with explicit, because that's, I think, a little easier to think through at first. We know who published what poems in what journals. And if we want access to this data, we need a very comprehensive bibliography for each country we're considering. And the good news is we have that. We have about, as you can see at the bottom, 100,000 discrete publication events from Japan from the 1920s to the 1940s. So now suddenly we know exactly who published what and where. So unfortunately, nobody wants to scroll through 100,000 rows in a SQL table. So maybe another way to think about this data is to think about it as a graph of interconnected nodes. Every time a poet publishes a poem in a journal, we can draw a line between that poet and a journal. So when Carl Sandburg first publishes the Chicago poem in Poetry magazine, we get an edge between two nodes. And what would that look like if we had that data at the scale of 100,000 publication events in the case of Japan? It sort of looks like this. And what we can do is we can actually look at that live. So here are a couple, it's actually just a couple years, 1929, 1931 in Japan. You can immediately see that there are two really important journals, Shito Shiron and Shin, which are here. I can further kind of query this graph, and I can say I'm interested in a particular poet, and I can drill down on him and see the journals in which Kusano Shinpei published. And every time I hover over different poets and journals, I can see their network, their sort of connection to each other, right? So this is an example of the simple who published what where, but we can do more interesting things. We can find all the foreigners whose poems were published in Japan, and we can find out where those poems were translated and in what journals they appeared. And then we can ask an algorithm to detect clusters, to find communities of certain types of foreigners who would get published in some journal and others would get published in another journal. And what this means is that you have essentially foreign poets in Japanese journals that cohere. That's every color there is a separate cluster. You could also say that you know enough about the ground truth of the literary history in Japan to say that you know who was a high modernist poet and who was an anarchist poet. And if you knew who was an anarchist, you could tag that particular poet. And then every single time that he or she published a poem in a journal, you could make that edge or that line pink. And that would be a way of understanding the position of the anarchists at certain points in time. What were their publication networks like? You can even think about the spatialization of publication data, because people have birthplaces and they have places where they're productive, and journals are published at certain places. So here you can see we're moving through the 1920s, and we're looking at, these are actually journals. The ones in red are anarchist journals, the ones in blue are high modernist journals. And this is just a live view of a current satellite photography of Google Earth, but what it's doing is it's showing you who is publishing what in different parts of Tokyo, right? You could also zoom out and think about the ways that we understand Japan today as being different from the ways that Japan understood itself back then. And you can think about the city of Dairen or Dailan here and see the ways that Japanese poetry was being published in places that are nowadays called China. You could turn on a map of, produced by the Japanese military in the 1930s of Dairen, and you could zoom in and see how the Japanese understood their own city and the ways that the publication of these modernist journals took place in this urban space. Now, not every country, not every language, not every civilization is as well documented as 20th century Japan. So a lot of people come to me and they say, I don't have 100,000 rows in a SQL database, or if I do, it's going to take me a long time to put it together. And so the question is, what do you do for network analysis if you don't have enough raw data? And I think the answer is just to make up the data yourself, and in a very serious way. So what we have is we have a project that's just underway here about trying to make sense of post-World War II European composition, that is, say, musical works. And this project is very simple. It's drawn on data from a Google spreadsheet, which is entered by a team of faculty members and graduate students. It's combined in real time into a faceted browse and search mechanism through Simile. And then there's a further thing, which is kind of interesting to play around with, which is that, so here we have MIT's Simile faceted browser, and so I can say show only Ligeti or show me only things which are orchestral in nature. I could go in, so these are all changing here on the left, right, and I could look at also what this team of researchers calls the topos, the sort of qualitative feeling they get when they listen to a piece and want to make a value judgment on it. So I can say, show me everything that evokes the topos of Mahler. And then the twist we put in is that we can then visualize those connected nodes through the d3.js visualization here. So I can say these are all the nodes connected to Mahler, and these are all these pieces. And let's see where ekphrasis comes in. It's connected to these different pieces, right? And I can release a node back into the gravitational pool. And I can look at it as a list, too. And this is what you get, fastest on the right, network diagram on the left. And just before I go to that last slide, I think that what's interesting about this musical composition example is that it's less empirical and it's more interpretive, right? You're relying on people to listen to music and to make value judgments about it. There's no shame in that. That's what we should be doing in the humanities, right? And as long as we understand these types of tools as playful explorations, as spaces to play around with this in front of a class or perhaps in an informal paper, as a place that you can get a value out of all the data entry you've done, as a way of turning a passive archive into an active space for research and exploration, I think that this type of thing is just as defensible as the highly empirical publication events of Japanese modernist poetry. So network analysis is, of course, a discipline. It essentially comes in to a certain degree through social science, right? And that's the way I think humanists have understood network analysis, through the social sciences. But it has its own mathematical basis. In terms of who has been helpful for me in understanding network analysis as a kind of DH practice, there are a lot of folks, but a graduate student in Kari Berner's lab, Scott Weingart at IU, and then, of course, Elijah Meeks at the Stanford University Library have been extraordinarily helpful and wonderful blog posts on this type of discipline. There was an NEH Advanced Institute on Network Analysis a couple of years ago held at UCLA, which a lot of people went to. Let's keep on going down this road of self-organizing data, though. And let's think about, we mentioned before that we could use explicit things, like two pieces sound like Mahler. We could say both poems were published in the same journal. But we can also have implicit or latent signals within the data. And latent approaches to this type of raw data rely on, of course, statistical patterns to separate signal from noise. And one example of this type of work would be, or the types of patterns which can emerge, is based on term occurrence. The phrase, you shall know a word by the company it keeps, of Firth in 1957. This turns out to be true mathematically also. We can discover topics or themes or discourses from observed documents using a technique called topic modeling. Now, I know there's at least one or two projects here at Yale which are using topic modeling, and I don't know if people in the room can raise their hand if they've heard of topic modeling before. That's wonderful. And people who've done it themselves? Right, the numbers go down. So it's a complicated thing to explain, and most people say don't try to explain it, especially somebody with as limited mathematical skills as myself. I won't attempt. This is Wade David Bly, a computer scientist at Princeton, explains it in his one of the seminal articles from 2001 on this. But the notion to keep in mind is it's a way of trying to identify hidden structure or themes within unlabeled text. And it does that by counting the co-occurrences of words. And rather than the example that David Bly uses here, which is about genomics, I thought it might make sense to think a little bit about Carl Sandburg and the ways that we might topic model Carl Sandburg. So there are three assumptions behind topic modeling. One is that documents contain topics, and that's a very sort of computer science way to phrase it. I think most humanists would say that books are about something, or poems are about something, right? The second assumption of computer science, of topic modeling, is that topics prefer certain words. And the way we would understand that in the literature domain would be to say that, themes are expressed in language, right? And that the weirdest part about topic modeling is there's a final third assumption, which holds that poems or novels or any type of documents might have been created by choosing words from topics randomly. And this generative story is imaginary. We know that people didn't write this way, but it's an important mathematical trick for something that's going to come later on. So here we have, at the bottom, we have Chicago poems, Cornhuskers, and Smoke and Steel, and we know those are the things which were actually printed by Sandburg, right? And then we have the kind of hidden structure or the themes of industry, masculinity, the city of Chicago, right? And we're trying to discover the connection between them. So again, here's Carl, and he's saying, I think I'm going to write a poem today, and I'm going to write a poem about, the poem has to be about three things. It has to be about industry, masculinity, and Chicago. So I've got three buckets in front of me on my desk, and I pick words out one by one, completely randomly, and see what comes out. We don't think actually this is how he wrote poetry, but it turns out to be an interesting game to play with yourself for the following reason. There's a kind of amazing magic trick in topic modeling, which is a statistical technique that allows us to infer the hidden structure, infer the themes of industry, of masculinity, of Chicago, all these things, by reversing the generative process. So instead of saying that, essentially what we can do is we can say, what are these poems about? This is easier to show than to tell, and so there's really important work that's happened in topic modeling in the last couple of years. One of the most striking things for me has been to follow the work of Cameron Blevins, a graduate student in history at Stanford University, who topic modeled Martha Ballard's diary. This is a midwife from Maine. And she kept a diary for decades. It was like she was tweeting every day, except she was writing the tweets down on paper. And this was rediscovered in the 1970s as part of sort of a feminist history project. And, the book was published on Martha Ballard 30, 40 years ago. What Blevins did was he went back and he scraped like an online archive, right, of all Martha Ballard's diary. And then he topic modeled it. He tried to use an algorithm to discover the hidden structure underneath the unlabeled text. And you should go visit Cameron's blog and read more about it, but this is one example of a theme or a discourse or a topic that Cameron discovered or the algorithm discovered for him, which was the topic of gardening. And you can see all the words that participate in this discourse of gardening. It's beans, corn, planted, cucumbers, potatoes. I mean, any person reading that would know what this topic is about. The algorithm doesn't know what it's about. It just knows that these words co-occur. In order to validate this approach, what Cameron did is he said, give me all these decades worth of these diaries and lay January to December over and over and over each other, one by one, and tell me how often this topic is present, is saturated in these individual diary entries. When he did that, you get the curve you're shown here, which is that Martha Ballard was talking more about gardening during the point in time when it started to become possible to plant in Maine. There's also another great project from the University of Richmond by Rob Nelson and a team there about topic modeling a Confederate newspaper called the Richmond Dispatch. And you can all visit, you should Google for Mining the Dispatch, you'll find this website, which is a fantastic application of finding hidden structure and unlabeled data in a Confederate newspaper from 1860 to 1865. He's got amazing examples up here that have to do with the relationship between fugitive slave ads and for-hired ads. And he didn't have graduate students label these articles. He asked the data to organize itself based on the frequency of terms that co-occur. So topic modeling as a digital humanities method is something that's gained a lot of ground in the last couple years, despite the kind of sort of obscurity of the underlying algorithm. There's this upcoming special issue of Poetics focused on topic modeling. The people that I've learned a lot from have been reading the work of Ben Schmidt, a postdoc at Harvard Cultural Observatory, and Ted Underwood, a professor of English at UIUC. Just a couple months ago, there was a topic modeling workshop at MIF, sponsored by the NEH. And one of the things we can do is we can take a corpus of poetry. So let's just take all the poems published in a given magazine between 1916 and 1940. And we can ask the algorithm to go through each of these poems. Again, we're not asking a graduate student to do this. We're asking a robot to read all of these poems and count how often words occur in proximity to each other. And it turns out if you do that, and we can see the results here, you get a bunch of interesting topics, or in the words of Ted Underwood, discourses. These are sort of themes. We have the theme of music, and these are poems which are highly saturated with the theme of music. We have a theme of terrain, of the urban city, right? And you can see that what's neat about this particular approach is that we aren't categorizing these poems into mutually exclusive categories. We're allowing the poems to participate in different discourses. This particular one participates in the discourse of both urban and music, right? If you scroll down and you can find some other, these are interesting ones, the Intangible Symphony here, which participates in the discourse of something we've labeled auditory. And we've labeled it auditory because we have words, music, sound, voice, laughing, right? But it also participates in the discourse of emotion, which we thought was kind of interesting. You can read all these poems by just clicking on a link, and it goes to JSTOR, and you can read the original if there's an ambiguity that you're trying to figure out. But the poems also are part of this kind of interconnected network of hidden structure, which has been discovered by the algorithm. Here you have, for example, Symphony of a Mexican Garden, which is connected with both auditory and music, which sort of makes sense if you think about it. And then if you drill down on the auditory category, you can find other ones that participate in discourses of emotion as well as auditory. The twist here comes that as interesting as it is to be able to categorize poetry, if you were confronted with an archive that was too big to read through, or if you were interested in the conversation between your own knowledge of an archive and an algorithm's understanding of an archive, as interesting as that is, we want to go further, and we want to think about ways that we can leverage humanities folks' domain expertise, what computer scientists would call domain expertise, your graduate education, the books you've written, your dissertation, all the work that you've put into particular authorships or moments or periods. And we want to figure out if there's a way to keep that information relevant in a time when it seems like only algorithms are capable of making sense of the great unread, the archive writ large. And the way to think about this, I think, is to use Franco Moretti's term, the great unread, as this huge circle on the right. I've just said maybe 1850 to 1923. You can set the limits to whatever you want them to be. And each of us bears within us knowledge about a specific subdomain within the great unread, right? All of O'Neill's family dramas about tuberculosis, right, were printed and went on a shelf and were collected and preserved. All of modernist poetry has been printed, right? There are novels about the countryside, Irish novels, stage realism plays. All of these are subsets of the great set, which is the great unread. And so we know, this is our disciplinary expertise, this is what we know. So we know there's an inherent passive relationship here, right? I mean, with the exception of people who are studying unpublished works and manuscripts, which is also important, but we know for printed material in Google Books, there's a passive relationship between the books that have been preserved and scanned and the smaller subset of books that we know very well. And the question really is, can we turn this relationship into an active one? Can we use what we know about a particular field to find interesting things to read more closely in an enormous sea of books that have been scanned, 20 million at this point? And so one approach that we took on the Google Books project was just something we termed subcorpus topic modeling. And what that is to try to apply the algorithm to subcorpora that are well understood. So this could be, again, everything that Eugene O'Neill ever wrote, or Ibsen after the Inferno period. All these things could be collections that you understand well and that you've written on or that you know something about. We've done the works of Darwin in translation, we've done Ibsen stage realism, we've done Danish folklore. Use your domain expertise to really look at the models that are produced by this algorithm, to understand the hidden structure that's exposed, and to make adjustments to say, this is too coarse or this is too fine. And then you can apply what we call these curated topic models. These topic models which emerge not from a great mass of unread 19th century poets or authors, but rather from those authors that you feel you know really well. Apply them to everything from Internet Archive, or apply them to everything from HathiTrust, and expose passages in books that you aren't reading that score highly for the same topics, the same hidden structure which you find interesting in your own research. We did this as an example on a gentleman called Evald Tang Christensen, who was a Danish gentleman. He was probably the largest and most prolific collector of folklore in Europe. He's unknown because he's from Denmark. So we basically were able to take about, that's true, we take about 14,000 folk tales from the Jutland Peninsula. These are tales about, vampires and werewolves and priests and women and cows and all the things you'd expect in rural Europe in the 19th century. And what we can do is we can build topic models from this folklore that we understand pretty well. A lot of work has been done on this guy. And this is just a topic that is about hearing voices. It's about a bunch of terms, both engrams and also unitary terms, that seem to cohere and that seem to co-occur, and that we've labeled hearing voices. And these are all the chunks on the right-hand side here of books from the 19th century print explosion in Scandinavia, which seem to score pretty highly for the topic or for the hidden structure, for the discourse of hearing voices. And here's a particular passage from a book by Henrik Pontoppidan. And we can analyze these books and analyze these paragraphs and analyze these things and figure out, is there anything we need to do a close reading on? And so, for example, we had a whole bunch of folklore that was cohering as kind of death in churchyards. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of folk tales about things that happen in churchyards, people who die in churchyards, the priest who's burying everybody. And we let the algorithm find all the terms in the folklore, rather than searching for the word churchyard or searching for the word priest, because we can't really say that we know what the corpus is going to be like. We want to find a kind of organic way to let the data organize itself. And unsurprisingly, once we had topic modeled the subcorpus, once we had topic modeled the thing we knew well, our disciplinary expertise, sort of obscure folklorist who not many people have heard of, then we sent that topic model out into the great unread. Then we sent it out into thousands and thousands of Danish books printed in the 19th century. And we said, go find us passages or paragraphs that seem to be highly saturated with the death and churchyards topic. So this is a passage from Herman Bang's Håbløseslægter article, book about this, the starving dog lying on his master's grave, right? Now, we could have probably found this paragraph if we had, but we couldn't have found it if we were searching for churchyard, right? Churchyard doesn't appear there. Cemetery doesn't appear there, right? And we wouldn't have found it by looking for the word dead, right? What we're trying to do is to find these co-occurrence of words that seem to expose a hidden structure in our subcorpus, and then use that as kind of Velcro or like a fishing hook to attract other articles. So just to review, we can let data, unlabeled data, without TEI, without XML, without any kind of human attention to it, just raw, dirty OCR with lots of problems. We can let that data organize itself through computational methods like topic modeling. We can then curate and evaluate that sort of hidden structure that emerges from the algorithm based on the work we've already done in graduate school, or the books we've written, or the classes we've taught. And then, we can wait till that projector comes back. And we can use that as a way of finding the aspects of the archive which are otherwise opaque to us, which are completely non-transparent, and which don't offer any kind of way in except for the algorithmic. And no problem. I think what's interesting about these types of approaches is they represent the sort of complementary use of algorithmic analysis of humanistic data, rather than saying we're going to throw away all our hard-run close reading. Rather than saying we're going to let robots take over our jobs, we're going to find ways to let the macroscope complement the microscope. And we're going to find ways to let our hard-won humanistic or historical expertise exist and actually become more valuable in a world where the digital has provided us with both great challenges of scale as well as great opportunities of new methodologies. Thanks very much.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I guess I have a privilege of starting out a question, and it's a question that I have that arises from something called the critical digital humanities. So if what we're doing is telling the robot to read according to what we already know from things we've close read as human beings, why is the computer going to tell us new things? Why isn't it just going where we told it to go in the first place?
Well, that's a great question. I think that's something we struggled with a lot when we were putting this research project together. One thing you might think would be, let's just take all 20 million books from Google Books and let's try to figure out how they organize themselves. And the thing we were afraid of in that scenario was that we needed a kind of Archimedean point. We needed a place outside the great unread, a place that was somehow anchored in some kind of humanistic tradition that we knew, whether it was French literature of the Revolution or whether it was the Enlightenment in Germany. We needed something that we thought a sort of a solid ground on which we could stand. You're right that by making our subcorpus selection, by saying these realist dramatists, right, O'Neill, Ibsen, Shaw, but not that realist dramatist, that we're making a choice and that we're probably missing people. But one of the experiments we did for this article was to topic model all of the discourse in what in the 19th century Scandinavia was called the modern breakthrough, Ibsen and Strindberg, and specifically choose only male authors. And so this was to be Ibsen and Strindberg and others. And then see what emerged as being thematically similar algorithmically. And what emerged as being thematically similar was, unsurprisingly, a whole bunch of women who were writing on the same themes. And this was kind of a ringer, because this work had already been done in the 1970s. People had laboriously read the archive and discovered Anne-Charlotte Loeffler and others who were writing of the same themes of sexuality and family and women's rights and economic rights as Ibsen and Strindberg. But we wanted this as kind of a test of our own approach. And so what we could easily do then is combine both male and female writers for a more diverse take on the modern breakthrough and as a kind of subcorpus that would work. I've seen some really amazing work from Matt Jockers recently on taking precisely this gender division and trying to figure out in his text mining work if you do have particular genres which include both men and women, split the men and women apart and figure out within each genre what words are more common, what phrases are more common, right? So I think it's dancing around this what we know and what we don't know. It's standing on the Archimedean point, but then being willing to kind of problematize the Archimedean point with new data. And that's, of course, the essence of Bayesian inference, right? That's the way that most statistics is done. To assume a prior, and then when new data comes in, you just refresh your assumptions, change your assumptions, and let the new insights emerge.
Okay, thank you. Questions generally? Yes. Please just say very briefly who you are.
Michael Printy, Wesleyan. I actually want to go home and start topic modeling now. So is that something I can do at home? Or is this something that requires a lot of setup?
Right.
I mean, we heard earlier about software or particular programs.
Yeah.
Or do I just need, a couple of tools in Google?
There are some great, I think the situation is much better today than it was 2 years ago, and it will be better 2 years in the future. There are some tools that attempt to wrap the underlying algorithms in kind of easy-to-use code. There was a hands-on workshop given at the DHWI, the Digital Humanities Winter Institute, by Matt Jockers a couple months ago at Maryland Myth. I think he's preparing a book on text mining with R, which is a statistical package. There is some software from University of Illinois, the Caesar project, funded by Mellon. But I think the short answer to you is it's still a little tricky. You have to be comfortable with a command line. And a lot of what the software I built over the last 2 years was just to visualize the results. Because what we found was that you could have the world's most sophisticated algorithm, but if it was spitting out tables of numbers to standard out on a Unix prompt, the penetration of that insight into the typical English professor's head was low. And so a key part of this is going to be, I think actually this follows up with some of the things that David was talking about, reusable web-based tools that aren't completely customized for everybody, but that have some degree of sophistication and rigor behind them, push down away from the quote-unquote elite and to the level where we all can create a graph or look at a map or do these types of things.
There and then here.
Peter from Yale History. I just wonder if it's possible to do this or analogous things with other media besides text, visual, auditory, or even cross-media.
It's a great question, and I think so I'm a literature person, not a mathematician, but I think one of the things that makes this world of algorithmic analysis so interesting is that the underlying math is truly universal. And people are using topic modeling to discover reoccurring patterns of notes in music, as long as you have computationally readable scores, like the kind that we saw from Todd today, you'd be able to do that. People have run topic modeling on ship's logs. Ben Schmidt ran it on ship's logs of whaling voyages to discover sort of voyages that cohered in time and space. So the neat thing about this is it really is applicable to almost any type of human-produced culture. The caveat would be that it's, I think, in my impression, easiest to do on text so far.
Hi, Andrew from Yale. I'm curious about choosing poetry as for topic modeling, because poetry depends so much on metaphor and simile and things like that, that I'm wondering if sometimes the topic modeling can identify topics but completely miss the point of the poem.
Right.
Like I'm looking at Shakespeare's 18th sonnet, shall I compare thee to a summer day?
Right.
And the topic modeling will pull up summer, weather, sun, death,
right.
life. But nowhere in here is, except for the phrase, thou art more lovely, there's nothing about what the topic modeling would pick, get all of that, but completely miss the point of the poem.
Right.
And I'm curious how you would address that in this.
So I think that you'd hope that the algorithm would miss the point. Otherwise, we'd be obsolete, right? If the algorithm could actually discern the point. I think one of the things that an algorithm like topic modeling might be useful would be discovering metaphors of seasons in this poetry, right? Because in some of the work I've done with this, you do see winter, spring, summer cohere, and you see seasons, and you see all these things. The exact degree of cohesion, of course, depends on the number of topics you choose. There's an interesting dissertation which was just defended at University of Maryland by Lisa Rohde, which I think tries to discover whether ekphrasis can be seen by the topic modeling algorithm. And I haven't read her dissertation, so I don't know if the answer is yes or no. But you're right that this would be a bad choice maybe for Shakespeare, somebody who is so well read and so well understood, right? Even if the sonnets are voluminous, this is like him and Chaucer, these are like the big people in English lit. What's more interesting is maybe all the forgotten poets, if not of the Elizabethan period, then certainly the print explosion of the 19th century and the 20th century, where a lot of this poetry just isn't very good, and you don't really want to waste a lot of time reading it. But if you were able to do in the space of 5 or 10 minutes a parse of tens of thousands of poems, and it could roughly show you what discourses this poetry participated in, it might be worth your time.
Another thing that sort of occurs to me is that it might be interesting to model how the world press covers particular disasters. Say, for instance, how the official press and the bloggers in China cover a train accident, or how,
right.
In order to see the questions of contemporary questions of censorship and challenge to that. So is there work that's done not on poetry or that kind of, but that kind of?
It's a great question. I think one of the things that jumps out at me from that question is the work done on the Richmond Dispatch, which is, of course, 1860s. But what's interesting about that is that the team at the University of Richmond has really uncovered all of these discourses that were present in the Confederate newspaper. these discourses, or what the computer scientists would call topics, have been labeled by Rob Nelson and his team of historians. And they're the most fascinating things you've ever read, because if you're not a Southern historian, which I'm not, there's like all these really interesting themes that emerge of like the anti-Northern diatribe, the poetry and patriotism topic, all of these ways that the Southerners, and many Southerners of many different viewpoints, wrote about themselves and about their cause. And the great thing about that particular project is it's a diachronic view. So it shows you, after this particular battle, how did this particular theme go up in the newspaper. I think the interface that Rob Nelson and his team wrote would be a good starting point for doing that with more contemporary sources. So.
Here and then there.
Thanks, Louis from the Yale Digital Collection Center. I'm not sure I could express this question, but let me try. So it's complicated enough, an algorithm, that it's hard to explain. Mm. And so I wonder, when you're looking at the results and making assertions, how confident we can continue to be that the algorithm actually supports the assertion, right, when the algorithm is more and more opaque. And I think over time they probably will get more and more sophisticated, and in that way I think opaque. So just to extend on that, a simple thing, I've always said a voice-to-text analysis for searching through video is really strong, because even if you only got 50% of the words right, that's 50% more than you ever had. Right. You know, you never had 50% of access. But then the question is, what assertions could you make about that when you only have 50%? So you did all the topic modeling. You were able to identify these topics, but you probably aren't clear on what you didn't identify.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that this, we're still getting used to the notion of this kind of, I'm not going to call it a black box algorithm, because it is well documented. And, you know, Ted Underwood, a professor at UIUC, wrote an implementation of the algorithm himself just to understand it. There are a few of us, including me, who could do that, but he did it. I think that we are still, as a field of historians and humanists, getting comfortable with this notion of what appears to us to be a black box algorithm. And I think you're right to highlight the risks of claims that emerge from methodologies which are not well understood and require, at least by people in many people in our field, and require a pretty sophisticated notion of math and Bayesian inference and those types of things. One way to get around those problems is to say, whenever we present the results of any kind of analysis, have the text on the right-hand side that you can click on and see what you're actually seeing. So that was a real priority to me when I wrote that web-based thing, was I want to see the poem. And I want to see not only the text, but I want to see the JSTOR page image, so that I can read it through and I can make my own decision. And this was part of what I talked about before about spitting the results of analysis out to a Unix command line versus integrating it into a web-based system where you can see the text that you're trying to analyze, whether that's a poem or a paragraph. So I think one key to making people comfortable with these types of things is to always present what's being analyzed alongside it, so you can make these types of decisions. And the other one is to look at graphs such as Cameron Blevins produced of the year-over-year gardening topic. And it just strikes me that any errors that are there, and there are many, right, because Martha Ballard didn't use standardized English spelling, right? Any errors should be, we assume, pretty reasonably distributed, right? The hypothesis would have to be that in the winter she used different words to talk about planting or gardening, right? I mean, we assume that there's going to be, you know, some sort of a consistent way that she spelled words, even if she spelled them the wrong way. And I think those types of graphs that have been produced by people like Nelson and Blevins are really important, because they're a way of checking what an algorithm is telling us against our own sort of knowledge of ground truth. Like, you can't plant in Maine in January. It's going to be a lot of hard work. Ground's going to be frozen, right? So it's not surprising that people who are keeping a diary of their daily lives start talking about that in April. But I agree, you know, David Bly came to the NEH, Tripp was there too. David Bly was there and talked about, you know, how much is this a black box algorithm? Do humanists need to understand it? And unless I'm misremembering, he said, you don't need to understand it. Just, you know, this works for many, many different fields. It's not something which is going to give you an absolute answer, but it's a good first pass at the data. And I think especially when you consider the alternatives, which are literally reading 20 million books, We may have to have a slightly different standard for the kind of first pass guide posting that takes us into the parts of the archive we actually have time to read.
Thank you. I'm Anders Winroth, History. I was very happy to see some umlauts on the screen.
Yes, right.
I think you already answered my question when you answered Louis, but I was wondering, you need the corpus to work with, the corpus of texts, and you take them for Google Books. How much of a problem is the OCR that goes into it, which I have often noticed has a particular problem with umlauts, for instance? Yes. And are those being solved? I often wondered, does Google Books go over it and OCR it again when they have more sophisticated technology?
Well, that's a great question. Speaking of black boxes, that is a big one. And I think the transparency you would hope to see there would probably come more from Hadi Trust, which is doing a lot of their own OCR work on page images, from Internet Archive even, Brewster Kahl's organization, San Francisco, which is very open about what it does. I think you're right that there are catastrophic problems with the recognition of a lot of forms of early, even Western European texts. Laura Mandel, formerly of Miami, Ohio, now at Texas, is working on a whole 18th century OCR project funded by Mellon for precisely this problem. French and English, but the fonts are different enough that it's a problem. The worst thing I've ever seen is, when Fraktur is not recognized as such, then it's truly gobbledygook.
Joan Shapiro. I'm a book indexer, and curious to know what you think about how this could be applied down the road to doing indexes, which is the kind of thing I do now, but mostly manually, using software to help alphabetize and check my cross-references, but there's still no way to make these cognitive connections except to have a person do a book index, and I see this as perhaps a little bit of a challenge to people in my area, because I wonder if it's going to come down to individual books.
It's a great question. I think that it would be, the one thing you don't want to give up is the hard-earned, decades and centuries-long worth of experience of people working in research libraries at doing things carefully, especially on treasured collections, such as the Native American collections we heard about today. I would never recommend any kind of first-pass algorithmic thing on collections where there were cultural sensitivities or where there were, even if there's a lot of material, if it's worth it to go through it. In my case, you're dealing with like pulp fiction from the 1880s, and it just didn't really seem worth it to read each one of these bad books, But you're right that we might be able to do first pass, even for internal purposes, right? Putting massive amounts of text through this type of many different algorithms, not just topic modeling, to guide people with really specific skills and experience to be able to get more of their work done more quickly, even if the final quality control requires a human touch.
So my question is really, I think, a clarification, but it touches on some of the points that have been raised already. Oh, and by the way, I'm F. Poudrier, I'm in the music department. You explained really well how you can use a well-known subcorpora to train the model, and then you kind of let that model loose on the great unread. But our well-understood subcorpora is a biased understanding of it. So I'm having trouble making the kind of understanding how applying that basically that trained model on biased understanding into that great unread, how that's going to yield new perspective on that great unread. So that's kind of the first part, and then the second part of it is we keep talking about one person reading 20 million books, and I started thinking about what about 20 million people reading one book and then talking to each other in some way. So the model is one person, it's one set of eyes. Is there any way that we could kind of unleash many set of eyes, which would kind of avoid maybe some of that bias that is brought by that well understood one subcorpora. I don't know if that makes any sense. But.
No, that's a great point. I think your second point really evokes some of the spirit of what Ray has been doing up at University of Victoria with the Social Edition Project, which he's presented on a couple times that I've heard. And I think it's really such a laudable and fascinating attempt even if, there's a spectrum of many readers, right, from 7 researchers split across the globe, but each at an elite institution, all the way down to some of the experiments by the Library of Congress with Flickr and tagging and folksonomies and things like that. University of Michigan has an interesting content management system which allows anybody with either a University of Michigan alumni account or a community account to go in and annotate not just text but images from their collections. So if you see a balloon, in late 19th century balloon photograph over Detroit and you're able to label certain areas of the city of Detroit, you can do this. And, obviously probably they evaluate those and make sure they aren't spam. But it is really a great sense of, on some of the most difficult things to do, we've heard today about how to do image annotation, and it requires a lot of infrastructure. They're doing it. And they're not doing it on books, they're doing it on images. The first part of your question is also a great challenge because it's this tension of, if you want this Euclidean, this kind of Archimedean point outside the great unread, right? But that's the result of a canonization process, right? This is what Moretti's talking about, 0.5%, right? So you have to take the good with the bad. The good news is we know, absent some library that burned down that we don't know about, that Tang Christensen published 47 volumes of Danish folklore, completely eclipsing anybody else who published folklore in that period. So if anybody read folklore in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, they were reading Tang Christensen. And so we're pretty sure that is, we can all think of the people within our own domains who have that role, right? Zola and Shaw and all these people in the realist movement. So I think it's an interesting problem of, I would say to you, just we can use this to expand the canon across things like gender, across class, across geography. Even if we start with a bias sample, we can add more data and revisit our assumptions based on new observations.
Okay, we are so lucky as to be able to continue this conversation with Peter in a few weeks. So thank you very much.